I always thought Sarah and I made a great team. We balanced each other out. I'm the steady one, the guy who likes a good plan and knows how to stick to it. Sarah? She's like a firework, full of light and unpredictability, lighting up any room she walks into. It was part of what I loved most about her, even if, sometimes, it kept me on my toes. We've been married for 10 years now, and for the most part, life's been good. Sure, there are the usual hiccups every couple has, but we built a life full of traditions that felt uniquely ours. Saturday mornings meant coffee on the back porch, Sunday afternoons meant browsing the farmer's market together, and we never went to bed without saying, "I love you." Lately, though, I'd sensed something had shifted in Sarah. She seemed restless, like something about our routine wasn't sitting right with her. I'd catch her staring out the window, her mind miles away. Once, she turned to me out of nowhere and asked, "Do you ever feel stuck?" "Stuck?" I had repeated, genuinely confused. "I mean, we're not teenagers anymore, Sarah. This is just life, isn't it?" She didn't answer right away, but the look on her face told me that my reply wasn't what she'd hoped for. Her friends were over a lot during that time, Jenna, Kate, and Maria. They've always been close, the kind of friends who can finish each other's sentences. They'd sit in the living room with Sarah, sipping wine and laughing about something or other, and I'd let them have their space. I was happy to see Sarah laughing again, even if it wasn't with me. It was Maria who came up with the horseback riding idea. I overheard them from the den. "Come on," she said. "Let's do something adventurous for once." "That actually sounds fun," Sarah replied, and when I peeked into the room, I saw her smiling in that wide, genuine way I hadn't seen in weeks. When she brought it up later that evening, I encouraged her to go for it. "If it makes you happy, Sarah, I'm all for it," I told her. She hugged me tightly, murmuring, "You're the best." At the time, it felt like a win, seeing her energized by something again. But I had no idea what this horseback riding trip would set into motion. I waved her off that Saturday morning as she left with her friends, their car packed with laughter and excitement. Standing in the driveway, I watched them disappear down the street, a little pang of loneliness hitting me. But I shook it off. She deserved to have fun. She needed this. Looking back, I wonder if I'd been too trusting or just blind. Maybe both. Either way, I couldn't have known what was coming next. When Sarah came back from that first horseback riding session, she was glowing. I hadn't seen her this energized in a long time. She couldn't stop talking about the stables, the horses, and the instructor, a guy named Owen, apparently. "He's got this whole rugged cowboy vibe," she said with a grin. "The kind of guy you'd expect to be roping cattle, not teaching suburban women how to ride." I laughed it off at the time. The way she said it felt harmless, like she was just sharing the day's highlights. But as the weeks went on, the stables became her new obsession. She started going every Saturday, sometimes twice a week, always with the same group of friends. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sarah had always been someone who threw herself into things full force when she found something she loved. I'd seen her do it with yoga, gardening, even that month she got obsessed with baking sourdough bread. But this time felt different. One night, she came home later than usual, cheeks flushed and hair tousled. "We stayed late to watch the sunset," she explained as she kicked off her boots by the door. "Sounds nice," I said, though a small part of me wondered why she hadn't thought to let me know she'd be late. Then there were the little changes. She started wearing different clothes, jeans that fit a little tighter, boots that looked brand new, even a hat that made her look like she'd stepped out of a Western catalog. "It's just practical for the stables," she said when I teased her about it. Her phone was another thing. Sarah had never been secretive before. She'd leave it lying around the house, sometimes forgetting where she'd put it altogether. But now, it was always within reach. She'd glance at it, smile, then set it down face down. I try not to overthink it. I told myself it was nothing, that Sarah was just enjoying her new hobby. But then there was the night I overheard her on the phone. I was in the kitchen, grabbing a drink, when I heard her laugh, a low, soft sound I hadn't heard in a while. "No, I won't forget," She was saying. Okay, okay. I'll see you Saturday. When I walked into the room, she jumped slightly and ended the call quickly. Who was that? I asked, trying to sound casual. Kate, she said a little too quickly. She was just reminding me about our plans this weekend. I wanted to believe her, so I didn't press. But something about the way she avoided my gaze stuck with me. Over the next week, I started paying more attention. Every Saturday, she left with her friends, but it seemed like Sarah was the only one who came back talking about the stables. Jenna mentioned a shopping trip they'd gone on one afternoon, which caught me off guard. I thought they'd all been riding that day. It wasn't until I bumped into Jenna at the grocery store that I decided to ask outright. Sarah really seems to be enjoying the stables, I said, keeping my tone light. Jenna paused, her expression unreadable. Oh yeah, she's really into it, she said carefully. But you know, sometimes she just goes on her own. She's the most into it out of all of us. That struck me as odd. Sarah never mentioned going alone. Why wouldn't she tell me? That night, as Sarah chatted animatedly about how she might start taking private lessons, I felt my stomach twist. Something wasn't adding up, and for the first time, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I didn't know the whole story. The next Saturday morning, I watched Sarah get ready, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. She looked radiant, her hair pulled back into a loose braid and a crisp button-down tucked into those tight jeans I'd come to recognize as her riding outfit. She caught me staring and smirked. What? She asked, playfully tossing her hat onto her head. Nothing, I said, forcing a smile. You look great, that's all. She kissed me on the cheek, her lips warm and quick. Thanks, babe. I'll be back by dinner. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange mixture of affection and unease. For a moment I stood there, debating whether I was overreacting or if there was something I needed to dig into. The unease won. I started with her social media. Sarah wasn't big on posting, but I figured if there were pictures of these riding sessions, they'd be on Jenna or Kate's pages. Scrolling through their profiles, I found photos of group lunches, shopping trips, and even a wine-tasting event, but not a single picture of Sarah on a horse. I kept digging, even clicking on Maria's profile, which was private. Nothing. I told myself to drop it, but the doubt had already taken root. That evening, as Sarah walked through the door, I casually asked how her day was. She launched into a story about a new horse she'd ridden. Chestnut with the softest eyes you've ever seen, she gushed. I nodded along, but her words felt hollow, like I was hearing them through a fog. Later that night, when she was in the shower, I glanced at her phone on the nightstand. It was unlocked. I hesitated. Sarah and I had always been big on trust, and invading her privacy felt wrong. But curiosity burned hotter than guilt. Her text messages were filled with the usual suspects: Jenna, Kate, and Maria. But one name stood out: Owen. I clicked on the thread. The messages weren't overtly romantic, but there was an easy familiarity between them. Owen, don't forget your gloves tomorrow, those reins will tear up your hands. Sarah, I think you just want an excuse to hold my hands again, winky face. Owen, caught me. See you tomorrow, beautiful. My breath hitched as I stared at the screen, rereading the words until they blurred. Beautiful? Holding hands? My pulse thundered in my ears. I locked the phone and set it back on the nightstand, my mind racing. For the first time, I wondered if I'd been a fool to brush off those little changes in Sarah. The new wardrobe, the constant texts, the late nights at the stables, it all pointed to something I didn't want to admit. When Sarah climbed into bed, her hair damp and her skin warm from the shower, I stayed quiet. I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Not yet. Instead, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with questions I wasn't ready to ask. The following week, I couldn't shake the messages I'd read. Owen. A name that now seemed to echo in my head like a bad song on repeat. I tried to tell myself that it might all be innocent, some playful banter, a joke taken out of context. But deep down, I knew better. I started noticing more things: small details I would have dismissed a month ago. Sarah started keeping her phone on silent, tucking it away in her bag when she thought I wasn't looking. She didn't mention horseback riding as much, even though she was still heading to the stables just as often. And there was the way she'd respond when I asked simple questions, too quick, too rehearsed, like she was always half expecting me to dig deeper. I decided I needed answers. That Saturday morning, as she packed her boots and gloves into the back seat and drove off, I waited just long enough for her to get out of the neighborhood. Then I grabbed my keys, slipped on a pair of sneakers, and followed her. I wasn't proud of myself. I'd never been the kind of guy who snooped or spied, but this wasn't just curiosity. It felt like I was fighting for my sanity, for proof that either I was losing my mind or Sarah was hiding something. Her car led me down winding backroads until we reached the stables. I parked a little way down the road, out of sight, and watched as she got out, looking as carefree as ever. She laughed at something on her phone, then glanced around before walking toward the barn. I waited a few minutes, nerves eating away at me, before stepping out of my truck. The air smelled of hay and horses, and I could hear faint laughter and the rhythmic clop of hooves against dirt. It wasn't until I reached the barn doors that I saw them, Sarah and Owen. He was leaning casually against one of the stalls, arms crossed, his cowboy hat tilted just enough to shade his face. Sarah stood close to him, closer than I'd ever seen her stand near anyone who wasn't me. They weren't touching, but the way they were talking, soft, intimate, like they were in their own little world, made my stomach churn. I stayed hidden, watching as Owen reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. Sarah laughed, her cheeks flushing the way they used to when I'd surprise her with flowers or a weekend getaway. It hit me like a punch to the gut. I turned and walked back to my truck, each step heavier than the last. I didn't need to see any more. My worst fears were standing right there in that barn, plain as day. By the time I got home, my head was spinning. How long had this been going on? Was it serious? Did she love him? I spent the rest of the day pacing the house, the walls closing in on me as I tried to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her the second she walked through the door, to demand an explanation. But another part of me, one I hated to admit existed, was scared of the answer. When Sarah finally came home that evening, she kissed me on the cheek, just like always, and asked what I wanted for dinner. Her voice was light, her smile effortless, like nothing had changed. But everything had. I didn't say anything that night. I just sat there, pretending to watch TV, while she chatted about her day. She talked about the stables, the horses, and how she might try a new riding trail next week. But she never mentioned Owen. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah and Owen in the barn, her laugh, the way he touched her hair. It was like my mind was on a loop, replaying every moment I'd seen, and plenty I hadn't but couldn't stop imagining. By morning, I knew I couldn't keep quiet anymore. The truth had been clawing at me for days now, and it was time to rip off the bandage. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she flipped pancakes. I stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment, wondering how we'd gotten here. She looked so normal, so... Sarah. Can we talk? I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She turned, spatula in hand, her brows knitting together. Of course. What's wrong? I gestured to the kitchen table, and she set the spatula down, wiping her hands on a towel before sitting across from me. Are you seeing someone else? The words came out bluntly, like I'd been holding my breath for hours and finally let it all out. Her eyes widened in shock, genuine shock. What? You heard me, I said, leaning forward. Are you seeing someone? Owen, maybe? She froze, her face going pale. For a moment, I thought she might try to deny it, but then her jaw tightened. What makes you think that? I scoffed, running a hand through my hair. I don't know, Sarah. The texts? The way you've been acting? Or maybe it's the fact that I saw you with him yesterday at the stables. Her mouth fell open, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. You followed me? Don't turn this around on me, I snapped, my voice rising. I'm not the one sneaking around behind your back. Sarah leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. It's not what you think, she said, her voice quieter now. Then what is it? I demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks an awful lot like you're having an affair. She hesitated, looking down at the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. The words hit me like a freight train. So you admit it? I said, my voice shaking. You've been seeing him? She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. It just happened, Jack. I didn't plan for this. I swear. That's supposed to make it better? I shot back, standing up so quickly my chair scraped against the floor. You didn't plan it? What, you just tripped and fell into his arms? Sarah flinched, and for a moment, I almost felt bad. Almost. But the anger bubbling inside me wouldn't let up. How long? I asked, my voice cold now. How long has this been going on? Just a couple of months, she said, wiping at her cheeks. It's not. Don't say it's not serious, I interrupted. You don't flirt with someone like that if it's not serious. You don't lie to your husband and sneak around for nothing. She didn't say anything, just sat there, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Why, Sarah? I asked after a long silence. Why him? Why this? She shook her head, tears spilling over. I don't know, she whispered. I was feeling stuck, and Owen, he made me feel alive again. Her words were like a slap to the face. Alive? What had we been building all these years if she needed someone else to feel alive? I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, her voice trailing after me. Jack, please. But I didn't stop. I needed space, time to think, to process what I'd just heard. As I walked out of the house, slamming the door behind me, one thing was clear: our life together wasn't the same anymore. And I didn't know if it ever could be. I drove aimlessly for hours after storming out of the house, the weight of Sarah's words crushing me with every mile. Alive again. That phrase gnawed at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. What did that make me? The man who'd spent 10 years by her side, building a life with her? Had I been slowly killing her spirit without even realizing it? By the time I parked outside a diner on the edge of town, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. I sat there, staring at the peeling paint on the diner's sign, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. I finally went inside, the clinking of silverware and low hum of conversation a welcome distraction. I ordered coffee I didn't want and sat there, my thoughts circling the same dark drain. She admitted it. She didn't even try to deny it. I replayed her words in my head, trying to understand. Was I blind? Naive? Or had she just been that good at hiding it? The way she cried at the table seemed real enough, but how could I trust anything about her anymore? By the time I returned home, the house was quiet. Sarah's car was in the driveway, but all the lights were off. I hesitated at the door, unsure if I was ready to face her again. When I walked inside, I found her sitting on the couch in the dark, clutching a mug of tea. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Jack, she said softly. We need to talk. I don't know if I have anything to say to you right now, I replied, shrugging off my jacket. She set the mug down on the coffee table, wringing her hands nervously. Please. Just let me explain. I sat down in the armchair across from her, keeping the distance between us. You've had all day to think about what you're going to say, I told her, my voice cold. So go ahead. Explain. She took a shaky breath, her eyes darting to the floor. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I swear. I was just... I don't know, Jack. I was in a rut. I felt invisible, like I was just going through the motions every day. And then I met Owen and he... She trailed off, her voice cracking. He what? I pressed. He gave you butterflies? Made you feel special? Her silence was all the answer I needed. That's not an excuse, Sarah, I said, anger flaring up again. If you were unhappy, you could have come to me. You could have talked to me instead of running to someone else. I know, she said quickly, tears streaming down her face. I know, Jack. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I don't even know how it got this far. That's the problem, I said, leaning forward. You didn't stop it. You didn't think about me, about us. You just let it happen. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. Part of me wanted to comfort her, but I stayed where I was, the betrayal too fresh to ignore. What do you want, Sarah? I asked after a long silence. Do you want to stay in this marriage, or do you want to be with him? Her head shot up, her eyes wide with panic. No, Jack. I don't want to lose you. I love you. This thing with Owen, it doesn't mean anything. Please believe me. I shook my head, letting out a bitter laugh. You can't throw around words like love and expect me to believe them, Sarah. Not after this. She reached for me, but I stood up, avoiding her touch. I need time, I said. I can't even look at you right now. Her sobs followed me as I walked upstairs and closed the bedroom door behind me. I locked it, more for my own sense of peace than anything else. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we were going to pick up the pieces of what was left of us, or if we even could. The next few days felt like a slow-motion nightmare. Sarah and I moved around the house like strangers, speaking only when necessary. Even then, the words were clipped and emotionless, as though either of us could muster the energy to pretend everything wasn't crumbling around us. I threw myself into work, taking on extra hours whenever I could. Anything to avoid coming home to the suffocating tension that filled every corner of the house. Sarah tried to reach out a couple of times, leaving dinner on the counter when I came home late, texting me during the day to ask how I was doing, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was Owen. Her laugh, her flushed cheeks, the way she looked at him in the barn. It was like a movie I couldn't turn off. By the fourth day, I couldn't take it anymore. I was sitting in the garage, nursing a beer and staring at the half-finished workbench I'd started building months ago, when my phone buzzed on the table. It was Jenna. The last person I expected. Hey, she said when I answered, her voice hesitant. You got a minute? What do you need, Jenna? I asked, more brusquely than I intended. She sighed. Look, I wasn't going to get involved, but I feel like I need to tell you something. My stomach twisted. What is it? It's about Sarah and Owen. I set the beer down, my grip tightening around the phone. Go on. Sarah's been talking to me, she said carefully, like she was afraid I'd hang up. She told me she's been seeing him for a while now. She swore it wasn't serious, but... Jack, I don't think she's being honest with herself. Or you. I felt like the floor was dropping out from under me. Why are you telling me this now? Because I know her, Jenna said. And I know she's not going to stop unless something forces her to. She's in too deep. My chest tightened. Did she tell you how long it's been going on? There was a pause. Almost 6 months, she admitted. I thought it was just a crush at first, but then she started pulling away from all of us, keeping secrets. That's when I realized it was more than that. 6 months. The words hit me like a hammer. While I'd been obliviously encouraging her to ride, thinking it was just a harmless hobby, she'd been building this thing with Owen. Thanks, Jenna, I said, my voice hollow. I appreciate you telling me. After I hung up, I sat there in silence, staring at the phone like it might give me more answers. But I already had enough. Too much, really. When I finally walked back into the house, Sarah was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine she wasn't reading. She looked up as I entered, her eyes searching mine. Jack? She asked tentatively. Why didn't you tell me it's been 6 months? I said, cutting straight to the point. Her face crumpled, guilt flashing across her features. Who told you? Does it matter? I shot back. You should have told me. I didn't think. No, you didn't think. I interrupted, my voice rising. You didn't think about me, or about us. You just, hoped I'd never find out. She stood, wringing her hands. I was scared, Jack. I didn't want to lose you. I didn't know how to stop. 6 months, I repeated, shaking my head. Do you know how humiliating this is? How much of an idiot I feel like right now? Her tears started again, but I didn't have the energy to comfort her this time. I felt hollow, drained, like there was nothing left to give. I don't think I can do this anymore, Sarah, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Her head snapped up, panic flooding her eyes. Jack, please. Don't say that. We can fix this. How? I asked, throwing my hands up. You've been lying to me for half a year. You've been sneaking around, having God knows what kind of relationship with another man. How do we come back from that? She took a step toward me, but I backed away, the space between us feeling like a chasm. I'll end it, she said desperately. I'll stop seeing him. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes, fear of losing me. But it wasn't enough to quiet the storm raging inside me. I need time to think, I said, turning toward the door. Jack, please, she called after me, her voice breaking. But I didn't stop. I walked out, her sobs echoing behind me, unsure if I was walking away for a night, or for good. I stayed with my brother, Mark, for the next few days. He didn't ask too many questions, which I appreciated, but he wasn't blind to the storm cloud I carried with me. Want to talk about it? He finally asked one night as we sat on his back porch, nursing beers. I shook my head. Not yet. He nodded, letting the silence stretch out. It was comforting, in a way, to just sit there with someone who didn't push. But as the days passed, the weight of the situation refused to lift. I thought I'd feel clarity by stepping away from Sarah, but the more I tried to sort through my emotions, the more tangled they became. Anger, hurt, betrayal, they all swirled together until I wasn't sure what I felt anymore. Mark gave me my space, but on the third night, as I stared blankly at the TV, he finally broke the silence. You're gonna have to decide sooner or later, Jack, he said, not unkindly. Staying in limbo is only gonna tear you apart. He was right, of course. I couldn't stay at his place forever, avoiding Sarah, avoiding the house. Eventually, I'd have to make a choice, fight for the life we'd built, or walk away from it entirely. The next morning, I packed my things and drove home, my chest tight the entire way. I still didn't have all the answers, but I knew I couldn't run from this forever. When I walked through the front door, Sarah was in the kitchen. She froze when she saw me, her eyes wide and uncertain. You came back, she said softly, almost like she didn't believe it. For now, I replied, setting my bag down. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, standing awkwardly as if waiting for a verdict. Can we talk? I nodded, following her into the living room. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between us feeling larger than ever. I ended it, she said quickly, as if that might fix everything. With Owen. I haven't talked to him since the day you left. I didn't say anything, letting her words hang in the air. I know I can't undo what I did, she continued, her voice trembling. But I swear, Jack, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. Her desperation was palpable, and for a moment, I almost believed her. But then the image of her and Owen in the barn crept back into my mind, and the anger flared again. I don't know if that's enough, Sarah, I said finally. I don't know if anything can fix this. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. Please, Jack. I love you. I never stopped loving you. I was stupid and selfish, and I hate myself for it. But I don't want to lose you. Her words cut deep, but they didn't erase the pain she'd caused. How do I trust you again? I asked, my voice breaking. How do I believe you when you say you love me, when you've been lying to me for months? I'll prove it, she said, her voice firm despite her tears. Whatever it takes, for however long it takes. Just give me the chance. I stared at her, trying to see the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. She was still there somewhere, but the cracks in the foundation of our marriage were glaring now, impossible to ignore. I need time, I said finally. And space. I can't just forgive and forget, Sarah. Not like that. She nodded, wiping at her cheeks. I understand. Take whatever time you need. Just don't give up on us yet. Please. I stood and walked toward the stairs, pausing halfway up to look back at her. She sat there on the couch, small and fragile, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of pity. But it wasn't enough to erase the betrayal. That night, I slept in the guest room, unsure if it was the first step toward healing, or the beginning of the end. The next few weeks were a strange dance of avoidance and forced civility. Sarah and I coexisted in the same house, but we felt like two strangers passing through each other's lives. She tried, I'll give her that. Little things, cooking dinner, asking how my day went, leaving sticky notes on the fridge with a simple, "Have a good day," scrawled on them. But the truth was, I didn't know how to let her back in. Every time she smiled at me, I questioned its authenticity. Every act of kindness felt like an apology she couldn't quite put into words. And every quiet night made me wonder if Owen was still lingering in her thoughts. Therapy came up early. Sarah suggested it almost immediately after I moved back in, but I didn't respond right away. It felt like putting a band-aid on a wound that still hadn't stopped bleeding. One night, after another silent dinner, Sarah finally broke the ice. "Jack," she said, her voice hesitant but steady. "I know I've said this before, but I'll do anything to fix this. I want to go to counseling, even if it's just for you to tell me how much I hurt you." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't just guilt or regret. It was resolve. "Why now?" I asked, my voice heavy with skepticism. "Why didn't you care enough to talk to me before all this?" She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "Because I was a coward," she admitted. "I thought I could handle everything on my own. I was afraid of admitting how lost I felt. And I didn't want to face the possibility that maybe I was the one breaking us, not you." Her honesty caught me off guard. For the first time, it felt like she was peeling back the layers, letting me see the raw, unpolished truth of what had driven her actions. "I don't know if counseling will fix anything," I said after a long silence. "But if we're going to try, we need to stop pretending like this didn't happen." Her face softened, a flicker of hope crossing her features. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for even considering it." We scheduled our first session the following week. Sitting in the therapist's office felt surreal, like airing out dirty laundry in front of a stranger. Sarah spoke first, her voice trembling as she laid everything bare. She talked about feeling invisible, about craving something that made her feel alive again, and about how much she regretted finding that validation in Owen. When it was my turn, the words spilled out of me in a flood. The betrayal, the humiliation, the rage, it all poured out in ways I hadn't allowed myself to express before. "I gave everything to this marriage," I said, my voice shaking. "And in one moment you made me question every good memory we've ever had. How do I move past that?" Sarah didn't interrupt, didn't try to defend herself. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face, as if she knew that no excuse she could offer would ever be enough. The sessions continued, and though they were painful, they also forced us to confront parts of our marriage we'd both ignored for years. The silence between us began to break, replaced by difficult but necessary conversations. One evening, after our third session, Sarah handed me a small leather-bound journal. "I've been writing in this," she said. "Every day since you left. It's everything I've been too afraid to say to you out loud." I stared at the journal, unsure whether to take it. Part of me didn't want to know what she'd been thinking, afraid it might only reopen wounds that were just starting to close. But another part of me, the part that still wanted to understand her, despite everything, reached for it. That night I sat on the edge of the guest bed, turning the pages slowly. Her words were raw, unfiltered, filled with pain and longing. I hate myself for what I did. I don't deserve Jack's forgiveness, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it if he'll let me. He doesn't look at me the same way anymore, and I don't blame him. I don't know if I'll ever see that love in his eyes again. As I read, something inside me shifted. The anger was still there, but it was joined by something else, understanding. Sarah's betrayal hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been born from cracks in our relationship that we both ignored, even if I hadn't strayed like she had. When I finished the journal, I found her sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She turned when she heard me, her expression wary. "I read it," I said simply. She swallowed hard, waiting for the verdict. "Thank you," I added, "for being honest." Her eyes glistened, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the faintest glimmer of hope in her expression. We weren't fixed. Not by a long shot. But for the first time since the truth had come out, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we had a chance to find our way back. The journal opened a door between us that had been sealed shut since the day I confronted her. Slowly, hesitantly, Sarah and I began talking again, not about Owen, not about the affair, but about us. The parts of our life we'd neglected, the places where we'd let the connection fray. It wasn't easy. Some nights, I'd catch myself staring at her across the dinner table, wondering if she was still hiding pieces of the truth. Other nights, the anger would creep back, unexpected and sharp, triggered by a word, a glance, or a random memory. But Sarah didn't retreat. She stood in the storm of my emotions, facing it head-on with a kind of quiet resilience I hadn't seen before. "I know you don't trust me," she said one night after I'd snapped at her for something trivial. "I know it's going to take time. But I'll be here, Jack. For as long as it takes." I didn't respond, but her words stayed with me. We kept going to counseling, even on the days I wanted to cancel and bury my head in work. The therapist pushed us to dig deeper, to confront the underlying fractures that had allowed the affair to happen in the first place. "I stopped seeing you, Jack," Sarah admitted during one session, her voice thick with emotion. "Not because of anything you did, but because I let myself get lost in the routine. You were always there, steady and constant, and I took that for granted. Owen wasn't better than you, not even close. He was just new." Her honesty stung, but it also brought clarity. For years, I prided myself on being the reliable one, the rock she could lean on. I hadn't realized how easily stability could start to feel like stagnation. For my part, I had to admit my own failings. I'd seen Sarah's restlessness, heard her talk about feeling stuck, but I hadn't really listened. I'd assumed our life was enough for her because it was enough for me. That realization hit hard. Still, forgiveness didn't come easily. There were moments when I wanted to believe in her, in us, but the scars of her betrayal ran deep. One Saturday, a few months after our first counseling session, Sarah asked me to come with her to the stables. "Why?" I asked, my tone more defensive than I intended. "Because I don't want that place to be a secret anymore," she said softly. "I want to show you what it is I love about it. I want you to see me." The words struck a chord I hadn't expected. I agreed, though my stomach twisted the entire drive there. The stables had become a symbol of everything broken between us, and part of me didn't want to face it. When we arrived, Sarah introduced me to the horses, her voice light and warm in a way I hadn't heard in months. She showed me the trails she rode, the spot by the fence where she liked to sit and watch the sunset. And then she turned to me, her eyes searching mine. "I want this to be ours," she said. "Not mine, not his. Ours. If you'll let it be." I didn't answer right away. I looked around, taking in the quiet beauty of the place, the way Sarah's eyes lit up when she talked about it. For the first time, I saw her without the shadow of Owen hanging over her. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's make it ours." She smiled, a tentative, fragile thing, but it was real. That day didn't erase the past. It didn't magically restore what we'd lost. But it was a step, a small, shaky step towards something new. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah and I kept rebuilding, brick by painstaking brick. I didn't forget what she'd done, but I also couldn't ignore the effort she was making to mend what she'd broken. Eventually, I started to trust her again. Not fully, not blindly, but enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. There are still hard days. Days when the memories resurface, unbidden and raw. But there are good days, too. Days when I see her smile, and it feels real again. Days when I catch myself reaching for her hand, and she squeezes mine like she's afraid to let go. Our marriage isn't the same as it was before the affair. But maybe that's okay. Maybe it's stronger for having been tested, for having survived. And maybe, just maybe, we're learning how to love each other all over again. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and when it's broken, the pain can feel insurmountable. Jack and Sarah's story is one of heartbreak, self-reflection, and the difficult path toward healing. It raises questions we all might face at some point. How do you rebuild trust when it's been shattered? Can a relationship survive betrayal, or is it better to walk away? If you've ever faced a similar challenge, or even if you haven't, take a moment to reflect. What would you do in Jack's place? Could you forgive? Could you fight for a love that's been tested like this? Every relationship has its trials, but it's how we respond to them that defines who we are. This story is a raw reminder of the complexities of love, and it leaves us with one lingering question: is it ever too late to start over? We'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you were in Jack's shoes? Do you think he made the right decision in giving their marriage a second chance? Or do you believe some lines, once crossed, can never be repaired? Share your perspective in the comments below. Whether it's advice, your own experiences, or your take on the story, your input could make a difference for someone else watching. Let's start a conversation and explore this complicated topic together.